Right, guys, so what we're looking at is purpose and context, because it's really important when you look at what attitudes and values are being challenged and what attitudes and values are being endorsed by Secret River. And it's going to be kind of the crux of any assignment that you write on it. So remember, when was this text released? Look it up. Yes, you're going to have to do some work. Thank you. 2005. Now, context matters because in the 2000s, Australia started to actually move forward. In fact, the very late 90s, we started to have land rights accepted in a governmental level. In the 2000s, in the last 20 years, we've had a Prime Minister apologise for the stolen generation. It started to be, we talked about the difference between the way that you're taught about Australian history and the way that I was taught as a 50-year-old this year when I was at this school, many, many years ago. You are starting to get more information about your history. So in terms of context, this is part of that movement to reconcile. It's part of a reconciliation movement within our society. It's a societal change. And it's a change in the way, as a former colony, we engage with our past. So that is its purpose. It's part of that movement by wider Australia, and if you wish, whiter Australia, to engage with their past. There's been a shift in language. While I was growing up, it would have been referred to as the settlement of Australia. And it was a colonisation. Today, it's much more accepted to use the word invasion. Your generation is much more comfortable with the word invasion than people of my generation and my parents' generation with the word invasion. However, it is not a completed process. It is part of a moving, evolving process in our society. And as such, it isn't a perfect text because it can't deliver you something that hasn't happened yet. That integration, there is no treaty with any of the Indigenous peoples of Australia. Land rights isn't settled. There is a lot to do, but this text is part of that movement. It is not a text that would have existed during my childhood, because that was before that acknowledgement. Now this is important to us as we look at why we study this text, and go back as well to the first of the questions that you're going to get the option to write on. How does this text deliberately unsettle us? Well, that depends upon who us is, but it's unsettling us because it wants to attack some concepts that are still within Australia. The concept of peaceful settlement. What do you think the concept of peaceful settlement is? Hands up. I think we looked over this no one's putting their hands up. Hands up if you actually don't know what peaceful settlement refers to. Okay. Most of you. Hands up if you can name two battles between Indigenous peoples and the invading peoples. Can you put your hand up and tell me? Do you believe there were none? Hands up, you believe there were some. But you can't name them. Can't name any of them. So because of that gap in our education and our exploration of our own history, a concept arose that people believed that Australia's settlement had been peaceful because there isn't any other information available to them. Also, smoothing the dying pillow. Do you remember from last year what smoothing the dying pillow referred to? It was a government policy. Smoothing the dying pillow. Do you remember? Yes?
They were trying to kill off the Aboriginal culture.
They did it in a very passive-aggressive way. What it was saying was the Aboriginal people will die. Their culture will disappear as a result of them being a minority within Australia. It was based on a premise that their culture and their genetics was weaker than the Europeans. And remember, these are people that have not been taught about the Aboriginal resistance to the invasion of their own country. So again, they believed in peaceful settlement, and so they believed that it was actually a natural occurrence. It's a very self-serving ideology, but it was the ideology of the main people. And smoothing the dying pillow was about making it easier for Aboriginal people at a government level to integrate into the European society. And it resulted, it's just a beautiful thing, smoothing the dying pillow, in other words, making the end of their culture easier. Yes, I see some of you looking a little bit, ooh, yeah, it is. It's very kind of passive-aggressive, if you will. And that's where you get the stolen generation, you get the removal to missions, you get the management by different groups within society, the refusal of acknowledgement of country, those kinds of things. So, a large amount of Australia, my generation specifically and before, were actually kind of denied information. And it did make reconciliation more difficult. And this text brings back that information. It's one of those ones that accepts that reconciliation can only come from a clear understanding of our history and an emotional engagement with the experiences of that history. Now, there are some moments in Secret River where she confronts us with some unsettling truths. Indigenous people were brutalised, were raped, were murdered, were tortured. They did resist. They did manage the land. There was the opportunity for the invading people to work with the Indigenous people to come to some kind of an understanding. And these are the unsettling truths she presents us with in this text. And that's the answer to that question, actually. Now, if you remove that purpose and that context, it just becomes a very confusing book, doesn't it? But when you put that context in, then you understand the decisions that she made, why she chose to have that really confronting scene with the massacre, why we had babies' heads chopped off, why we got to see the smell and the physicality of the Indigenous woman who has been raped, why we get a character like Smasher that verbalises some of the worst parts of that society. In a book that can be quite reserved when looking at Indigenous characters and their experiences, those moments stick out, and that is their purpose because of our context as a society that does not share that information. Some people still do not understand that Australia had slavery. Hands up if you've never heard the treatment of the Aboriginal people referred to as slavery before. Okay. But what do you call it when Indigenous people are forced by the government to work for farmers and for white people and withholds their wages? What is that called? Yeah. But we don't use that word, do we? So we're not really finished that process, have we? Okay. Now at this point, take a moment to look through your notes and see if you have any questions. Remember that this will be useful for tomorrow's work where we look at structuring of essays. Take a quick look through. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me them. You're all in shock. It's the morning, I know. If it helps, I'll let you know that this is like my second massive caffeinated drink for the day. And I'm only just awake. And another teacher seeing me come to class and looking at how tired I was actually gave me this. So it's one of those days. Alright, I am open to questions now. Would anyone like to ask me anything for clarification? I think there's one thing we should do before we close and let you get on to the next section. Oh, was your hand up? Oh, just scratching your head. Why does she make the choice again? If she wants this reconciliation with our past and she wants this understanding of the Indigenous viewpoint of history, why does she make the choice not to include Indigenous characters, dialogue and thoughts? Why does she make that choice? Do you remember? No idea? Alright, so you might want to write this down. She has said in many interviews that she made that choice because as a white Australian, she felt it would be cultural appropriation to appropriate their experiences, which she herself does not understand or share in a book. And she felt that those stories are best told by Aboriginal people. Now you can have some questions about how that may harm the overall premise. I certainly feel that there were ways around that problem, such as consultation with Indigenous peoples, but that is her reasoning. Any last questions? Alright, so the rest of this lesson I will be over at my desk. Remember, it is the last in-class lesson with the creative writing piece before you on your own or next week. And from now on, after today, we'll be working on essay construction and the assignment coming up. Are there any questions? All right, remember, I can be approached. Okay, to work.